Well, good evening, everybody at home, and welcome to this Cambridge
Hello.
Royal Society event. So COVID, this thing that we are all desperate to leave behind and get back to our lives and move on to normal, whatever normal is these days. But for many people the last couple of years, let's face it, they've been to hell and back with their lives. So we're all looking for some positive consequences, some good things that might have come out of the pandemic. People, starting to really reevaluate what's important in their lives, their families, where they live and how they live. They're thinking about where to work and how they're working. Because, we can all work from home a lot more now. So that's great, right? Or is it? And that's the question we're going to be looking at tonight, particularly with women in mind. And I'm delighted to be joined by four seriously impressive women who are going to give us their insights into what life really is like for women post-COVID. What it means for their education, for their careers, in positions of leadership, in politics. And I think that's why Cambridge Festival have dragged me out of hibernation tonight to talk a little bit about that too. First of all, we're going to hear from our speakers one by one. Then we're going to open up to a general conversation like only women can. And then I'm hoping there's going to be lots of questions from the audience that you're going to participate in that we can put to our speakers. Now, the way you can contribute this evening, a website is slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, dead easy to use. All you've got to put in is the event ID for tonight, which is a 7-digit number, 7325052. So that's slido.com, and the ID you need to punch in is 7325052. So let's get straight to our first of our very impressive speakers tonight. Mary Ann. She spent 20 years as the assistant editor and a columnist at the Times, and has won a very large following for her columns on politics, on economics, feminism, parenthood, and just life in general. She's presented many programmes on BBC Radio 4, on the television on BBC 2, and has recently spent a year as a visiting fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. She's a visiting professor at King's College London 2, and is the chair of judges for this year's Women's Prize for Fiction. If that wasn't enough, she's just written her latest book, The Authority Gap, which is a study of women and why they're taken less seriously than men and what can they do about it. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Mary Ann. Good evening.
Good evening, Heidi, and thank you very much. I'm going to start by talking about women in power during COVID and then go on to talk about women in power after COVID, because I think the pandemic has told us a lot about women and power. So a fascinating academic study of the British government's press briefings, the press conferences during COVID, found that nearly half of them had not a single woman in the room. Well, obviously amongst the journalists, but not a single woman on the panel. So you'd get a male politician flanked by two male experts, and nearly half of them. And only one female cabinet minister ever led a briefing. So 54 out of 56 briefings were led by a male politician. Now, of course, there are more male members of the cabinet, but 2/3 of all the male cabinet ministers got to lead a briefing, and only 1 in 6 are the women. And that woman was Priti Patel, who did 2 out of the 56. And yet Therese Coffey, who is Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, had a lot to do with COVID, all those people signing on for universal credit, which, by the way, didn't bust the system. That was a real dog that didn't bark during the pandemic. And Liz Truss is Minister for Women and Equalities. She never got to lead a press conference either. Now, it's not just here. So when Donald Trump set up his first White House coronavirus task force, 12 out of 12 of the people on it were male. And women made up only 20% of the WHO's emergency committee on COVID. And this is a very common phenomenon, that when the going gets tough, women get shunted aside. It happens every general election campaign. There's the obligatory feature saying, where are all the women? Because it's always the men leading the press conferences during general elections. It's the same at the moment in the war in Ukraine. Look at the peace talks that are going on. On both sides, the delegations are universally male, despite the fact that actually academic research has shown that peace negotiations with more women in them are more likely to take hold and more likely to deliver peace. And this really matters because when women are present in decision making, the consequences are better outcomes for women as well as men, because they concentrate on the issues that men often don't think about. like the fact that women had to take a disproportionate share of the unpaid labour during lockdowns, a disproportionate share of the homeschooling, even if they, as well as their male partners, had full-time jobs. Women did far more than men. Domestic abuse rose hugely during lockdowns, and this is something obviously that women suffer from a lot more than men. In most countries in the world, more women than men lost their jobs during the pandemic. That's not actually true here in the UK, by the way, but I think because retail and hospitality suffered most from lockdowns, and more women are involved in those fields, more of them lost their jobs. And 70% of health and social care workers right at the front line are female. But it also matters not just for policy reasons, but for subliminal ones. I've written this book called The Authority Gap, and it's about how we are less likely to accord authority to women than we are to men. And if the experts that you're putting up every single day at the press conference are much more likely to be men than women, that is subliminally sending the message that it's men who know more about this sort of thing than women do. Despite the fact that Sarah Gilbert helped to invent the Oxford AstraZeneca virus, and Kate Bingham actually brought the vaccines, to the public. What about women in power post-COVID, though? Jennifer knows far more than I do about the effectiveness of female leaders. A lot of people have claimed they were actually more effective than male leaders, that it is difficult to prove causation. But at least it showed that women were every bit as good as men at leadership. And in terms of women in power more generally, I think that Heidi said earlier that flexible working was really going to help. I think actually it goes both ways. Yes, it is fantastic that we have now proved what a lot of us have been campaigning for the last 30 years, which is that it is possible to be just as productive, working from home, working flexibly, working hours that suit us. Not in all jobs, obviously, but in a lot of them. On the other hand, my fear is that post-pandemic, it's going to be the men who go back into the office, do the schmoozing of their bosses, get noticed and get promoted, while women are more likely to be working diligently from home and not noticed and not promoted. So I think organisations have to think very carefully about that. I think that's probably my 5 minutes up.
Gosh, I was just getting stuck in there, Mary. I was scribbling notes, furiously listening to you.
Oh, well, I was being very disciplined about time.
You are being very disciplined, very organised. I need to be disciplined, first of all, by saying that I've already failed this evening. The Slido code, in fact, is not the number I gave you. I gave you one number too many. Thank you very much to Zoe for emailing in with that fact. It should be 732505. Much easier, just 6 digits, 732505. Thank you, Marianne. And our next speaker is Resham, who I knew before this evening. Of all our speakers, I've got to know 3 great new women, but I did know Resham before for reasons that will become clear. So Resham is a policy specialist, that's what she does. And she's the head of policy and government relations, Europe, Middle East, Africa at WISE. She's been active in politics for the past 10 years, and she stood as a Conservative Party candidate, both in the 2015 and the 2017 general election. In fact, I believe was the youngest BME candidate for the Tory party in 15. And that's what we have in common, because I also stood as a Conservative Party candidate in 2015 and 17, just checking it was Conservative both times it was. And why and how did I get involved with the Conservative Party as a woman? Because of an organisation that Resham helps to lead. She's the head of engagement for Women to Win, an organisation set up partly by our former Prime Minister, Theresa May. And it's all about getting women of all parties actually more elected into Parliament. And she's a trustee of the Forset Society, who people will know, I'm sure, as the UK's leading charity campaigning for gender equality and women's rights. So with no further ado, Resham, what have you got for us this evening?
Thank you so much, Heidi, for that very generous introduction. Lovely to see you again. And as you say, to meet the other 3 brilliant women, such a pleasure to be here. And yes, Marianne's given us lots already, but just a few things from a political perspective and from a leadership perspective, because I do think some of these stats and figures are really important to know. In business, women remain just 8% of FTSE 100 CEOs. And I think the intersectionality point is so important because none of the women of the FTSE 100 CEOs are women of colour. In law, women account for 30% of High Court judges, and there are only 2 female Supreme Court justices. Again, none are women of colour. And when it comes to Parliament and we look at our leadership from a political perspective, the last two general elections have seen not that much progress despite the hard work of Women to Win and many, many organisations across different parties, including the 50-50 campaign and the Labour Women's Network and all the other great organisations working so hard. And actually, we've only seen the proportion of female MPs moving from 32% in 2017 to 34% now, so still only a third. And of that, only 36 women of colour are MPs, which is 6% of all MPs. And why is this important? Because so often I'll hear people say, well, we just want the best person for the job. And I'm thinking, yes, I'm with you. We also want the best person for the job. But the reality is that men and women, people of colour, women of colour, have different life experiences, not better, not worse, but different. And that means that the more we have that diversity represented in Parliament, the more different life experiences and different backgrounds and different people are represented, the better our policy making becomes. Women, of course, can and should be speaking to all matters, whether that's the things we're normally associated with, which are health and education, but of course, all matters across the economy and tax and healthcare and foreign affairs. And as Marianne pointed out, when women are involved in peace negotiations, for example, it's much more likely to be successful. But we do have female MPs to thank for things like the Equal Pay Act and for many changes around domestic violence or childcare. And during COVID, we saw not only a lack of women in the important rooms making decisions, but around the ability to actually raise some of these issues. There's a reason why the lack of women in the top room meant that it was okay for my husband to have his facial hair dealt with professionally a long time before it was okay for me to do so according to COVID rules, even though from a society perspective, of course, it's much more socially acceptable for him to have facial hair than it is for me. And so why is this? Why are we not getting enough women either coming forward or, more importantly, being successful even when they do come forward to try and be MPs or politicians at the local level? Well, the Fawcett Society does a lot of great research and work on these, did a research paper, and it was a Strategies for Success research paper, and it showed that across the political spectrum, there's still this model of an ideal candidate of what an MP looks like. And it won't surprise you to hear that most people, when they think of their MP or an MP, picture a white male of a certain age, which means that selectorates, people who get to choose candidates, have that as the standard. So a woman has to work much harder, a woman of colour harder still to be perceived as someone who could fit that model. And it also puts off women from coming forward because they don't see themselves in the role models that they see. During selections across party, we see women being questioned about childcare in a way that men are not. There's actually one female minister who told me that she was asked how she handles childcare for her 3 children, and she turned around to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was standing there, and said, well, Jacob's got more kids than me. Have you asked him how he handles his? And of course, no one had ever asked Jacob how he handles his childcare. And equally, women are judged then for not having children. So it's almost a lose-lose when you're a political candidate as a woman of a certain age. And then once women are selected and elected, there's then the issue around retaining these women. So data shows that women stay in Parliament for a shorter period of time than their male counterparts. And a huge element of that is to do with the abuse that they receive. So studies have been done to show that a significant number of women receive death threats and rape threats. And when I talk about my time, my experience standing twice, I say things like, I've not had a death threat yet or a rape threat yet, very conscious that I'm one of the lucky few and that's probably something I won't be able to say going forward. And so what do we do? And I'll keep this short, and we can cover it more in questions, but there's lots of different things to do. So behavioural economics and nudge theory shows that by showing that an MP can look and be different to that stereotypical white male of a certain age, voters and selectors are much more likely to select different people. So at Women to Win, we did a video showing MPs from different ethnic minority backgrounds and women talking about the job, and people were much more open to selecting women after seeing that actually MPs look different to what people have in their head. There was a study a behavioural economist told me about where they found that just by showing a photo of a female politician, in a lot of cases that was Margaret Thatcher, people were much more likely to be open to selecting a woman. And it's about thinking about the outreach work and the role modelling that we do. So getting more female MPs on TV, getting more young people to see women standing. So the last thing I'll share before I hand back, Heidi, because I'm conscious of my time too, is previously I lived in Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and my MP at the time until the most recent election was Nick Hurd. I badgered him about this. It must take me along with you to schools when you speak, and he was brilliant about it and took me along with him. And Nick Hurd is a fantastic guy, was a great MP, very inspirational. But it was amazing how even though I had no official title and wasn't I wasn't an MP, how many of the young people, especially those from BME backgrounds or the young girls, wanted to come to talk to me about politics, because they didn't see themselves in a white man of a certain age. And so just giving young people or women or people from an ethnic minority background the chance to speak to people that they can see themselves in is a way that we can get many more women selected and elected, and therefore change the face of politics to represent the people that we're supposed to be representing.
Brilliant, thank you, Resham. And you're absolutely right. When I think back and reflect on my time as an MP, it's those human personal relationships that really make a difference. And if people can't engage with you, you can't help them. So they have to be able to talk to you. Brilliant. And my next speaker, a woman who is passion personified. Vakala, it's so great that you've joined us this evening. Now, what do we know about you? Well, your corporate career, let's face it, has been in quite a male environment, holding senior risk and control jobs in some of the biggest banks in the world, Barclays, JP Morgan, HSBC and Deloitte. But what we're really delighted, the reason that you're joining us for this evening, that's great, of course it is, but it's the other work that you do, that you founded, and you're the chief exec of an online careers development platform called Career Masterclass, which is, your passion is getting more women, and particularly women of an ethnic minority background, into careers, progressing in careers, and it's the bespoke support you give them and the mentoring coaching that you provide that we're particularly pleased that you joined us. You can tell us about that. So Bacola, tell us about your world and the work you've been doing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Heidi. And I was just carried away listening to Marianne and Resham. I've learned so much already. Thank you. So for me, the world I live in sort of straddles corporate and also this thing that is my passion. And I think everyone believes that when you find your purpose, the actual reason why you are here, then you are lucky. And I count myself as one of the lucky ones, because my life's work is to ensure that corporate UK or global organizations are representative of the environments in which they operate. And so for me, that means getting more people from an ethnic minority background into corporate roles, and also ensuring that when they do get there, that they progress and they are promoted at the same pace as their counterparts. So what we do is we work with a lot of global organizations to help them design and develop real programs and interventions that can really move the dial. Because as you all know, the work we do and what we talk about in society, especially around the lived experiences of Black and Brown people in the workplace, is still not great. Like Resham said, for the first time in FTSE 100, we have no Black person in the C-suite. That means no CEO is Black, no COO is Black, no CMO is Black. So that is not progress, is actually retrogression. And then when you look at that against the reports that the government issued last year, where they've said the UK is not the UK and UK corporates is not institutionally racist, that is not what evidence tells us from the work that we do and what we see. And COVID was very important, and it was very, very interesting because two things happened at the same time. So in 2020, as you know, the world went into lockdown. We were dealing with this new thing. People were in pain, people were losing people, and also people were forced to stay at home. So for the first time, people were a lot more engaged online, and people had more time to engage with issues they normally wouldn't engage with. Because when you're sort of hustling for a seat on the Jubilee line, that's not when you really have the time to really engage with things that are sort of happening outside of your normal consciousness. But because we're all forced to stay at home, we're all forced to engage with what then happened in the summer of 2020. And that is when the entire world essentially witnessed the brutal death of the gentleman in the US called George Floyd. And before that, the Black Lives Matter movement had been happening. People had been agitating for change. A lot of people had been doing the advocacy work, and people had been calling for, and not just in America, but also on the other side of the pond here in the UK, people had been advocating for the fact that society, the very fabric of society, cannot continue this way. We cannot have two different races living in the same society, working the same jobs, working in the same organizations, and having two completely different experiences. But what then happened was everyone was forced to deal with the consequence of what we saw play out on our TV, on our mobile phones, on our iPads. For the first time, it wasn't like, he was shooting at the cops or he was running away. Everyone saw how this man was brutally murdered just because of his color. And of course, what then happened was a lot of companies quickly started making a lot of commitments. Oh, we are going to do this and we are going to do that. And they were really brilliant PR statements. But what we started to see was before the Black Lives Matter movement, there had been a lot of diversity within a lot of organizations, especially the big ones that have what we call diversity dollars to throw at the problem. A lot of it was focused on gender, and rightly so, because when we look at the proportion of women in leadership positions, just like Resham has talked about the stats, it wasn't great. And a lot of companies that said, we're an equal opportunity employer. We want to make sure that that we're in a meritocracy and that the cream always rises to the top. The cream does not always rise to the top. And so there are a lot of organizations that started to do good work using organizations like the 30% Club and a lot of women in banking and finance, women in the city had done great work to start to move that dial. But this is where the intersectionality is important, because when we even look at the progress that was made in pushing women forward into becoming CEOs and into becoming MDs and partners in some of these biggest organizations in the world, it actively excluded women of color. So that means even within the broader diversity and inclusion context, it wasn't very inclusive. And so what then happened was organizations then had a difficult decision to make as to how do we make this new thing that we're being confronted in, especially on the race agenda, how do we marry it with what we're already doing on the gender path to ensure that when we talk about building inclusive environments and inclusive organizations, we are not actively excluding other people? And how do we do this in an environment of COVID when we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty? At that time, a lot of companies did not even know that it was going to be a growth year because COVID was massively decimating bottom lines, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the ecosystem. But what we then saw was even when gains started to be made in terms of promoting people of color, the Black males were getting the jobs, right? So even when you then look at all of the other things that were happening, and you look at the stats that came out of COVID, a lot of people, people knew that Black people were disproportionately represented in the deaths that happened early on in COVID. And then when you break down that figure, you then see that it was mainly the frontline workers in the hospitals, the nurses, where we had some very disturbing stats around the Black nurses and the brown nurses were the ones in the time when we didn't have PPEs. They were the ones that were being pushed to go and deal with COVID patients. So it looked like the experience of the Black and brown woman was absolutely appalling throughout COVID, not only from a healthcare perspective, not only from a from just the pain and suffering and the mortality perspective, but also when we started to reap the gains of what happened within Black Lives Matter movement, the Black and brown woman was also actively excluded. So the experience of the woman of color in COVID was not great. And then you then needed to add another layer to that, just like Resham has said and Marianne was talking about. All of us were stuck at home. We had to homeschool our children. And who was it that took on the bulk of that home caring responsibilities, even while working full-time jobs themselves? It was the woman. It was the women at home. It was the Black and the women from ethnic minority backgrounds, and those careers took a backseat. Now, those things do not happen in a vacuum, because I've worked in big, large corporate organizations, and there is yes, we will support you. It's okay for you to work at a time that suits you, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, so that is done from the top. That is what people at the top, at the C-suites, like Exco -1, that's what they would say. But we all know that middle management is where all good intentions go to die. So if you are a woman that is unfortunate enough to have one of those managers that are inflexible, maybe has never had to, does not lacks empathy, and those kind of things are not realities, then you can see how all of those things compounded to seeing what the stats that we saw in COVID, where record numbers of women left the workplace, just because it wasn't just the one thing, it was a confluence of so many other things that meant that they needed to choose. And then lastly, one of the other things I would say was there was a report that was done after COVID that looked at the effects of COVID on women's mental health. And it showed that women were disproportionately affected in terms of their mental health, in terms of burnout and stress. And again, women are also the ones that have carrying capacity for aged parents. So all those people that were delivering meals, to neighbors in communities, a lot of them were women. A lot of those things, or those initiatives, grassroots initiatives, were run by women. All those people going in to look into the window and check on their aged parents and delivering food on the doorsteps, a lot of those people were women as well. So it is then no surprise for this research to have shown that as a result of COVID and a lot of caring responsibilities, and still having to pay the bills, and still having to think about how to keep a career going, that all of those things had a disproportionate effect on women's mental health during COVID, leading to the burnout, and just leading to people thinking, if one thing has to give, then I'm going to give up my career. And that's, as a society, is not a place that we should be, because if we have an army of women who are as talented as men, if not more talented, who are good problem solvers, who can show and demonstrate that they can organize, they have empathy, they can multitask. And if all these women are not choosing to duck out of society, what are some of the practical solutions that we, as from a governmental level, but also as organizations, what are those things that we can do to ensure that women don't feel like they have to choose between caring responsibilities or their mental health or keeping a career going? So I'm sure we can talk about some of those practical solutions when we come to the discussion part.
I tell you what, had we been in the room and some of those government COVID COBRA meetings, I wonder how different the outcome may have been. That's just so inspiring. Thank you, Bukola. And our final speaker, just another wonderful woman who we, were slightly concerned for. She's in the sunshine in Los Angeles this morning, so we're really, really worried for her and send her our best wishes. Hope the weather gets bad soon for you, rain like we have here. Jennifer is, amongst many things, so many skills, but she's the Associate Professor of Politics and the Director of the Centre of Research and Scholarship at Occidental College in LA. Her research on gender and women's political representation and participation has appeared in over 20 peer-reviewed journals. She consults regularly for international organisations and for national governments on how to boost the number of women in elected office. So full circle from the beginning of our conversation this evening. And only recently for UN Women, she's co-authored 2 reports on women leaders and COVID-19, the response and the recovery. And her writing on women and political empowerment, name a newspaper and pretty much Jennifer has an article in there. So no pressure, Jennifer, but what are you going to inspire us with now?
My goodness, thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'm so happy to be joining the team in the UK today, and I wish I could package some sunshine and send it to you. Such an honor to be here. And so what I want to do is do a quick global tour that are going to hit the highlights of women in power in COVID-19 and emphasize some of the comments that the fabulous women before me mentioned. So let's start 2 years ago. So about 2 years ago, when the pandemic first paralyzed the globe, yes, it's been 2 years, there were media reports and narratives that women leaders were better at managing the pandemic. And so this was a very catchy story. But what drew my attention as a scholar of women in political representation was that at this point, only 11 women served as the sole or top chief executives. Only 11 women. Moreover, those women were concentrated in advanced, wealthy democracies that we think might have some advantages in fighting the pandemic. High levels of citizen trust, strong welfare states, and actually a lot of them were islands: New Zealand, Iceland, Taiwan. So in my early research on this, I argued that the correlation was in fact spurious, that advanced wealthy democracies had the kind of resources to excel at containing the pandemic,
And we're also the kinds of countries that are likely to elect women. So why was this important to point out? Because women's paths to leadership, especially executive leadership, are still shaped by gender stereotypes. So on the one hand, this narrative was so compelling because the cool-headed competence of prime ministers like Jacinda Ardern contrasted with the blustering incompetence of leaders like Donald Trump in the United States and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. And so it did challenge stereotypes that women don't have what it takes to govern in crisis. But at the same time, continuing to link women with more caring and feminized styles of leadership can have consequences for their long-term access to power. And it also obscured the most important trend of the past 2 years, which is actually the absence of women leaders from COVID-19 response and recovery. And it's not just that women remain underrepresented as prime ministers, as presidents, as governors, mayors, ministers, and parliamentarians. It's that especially in the pandemic's early days, the way pandemic decisions were made, where they were made in emergency contexts. So for democracies, that meant concentrating hands in the power of the executive, removing a lot of the checks and balances and forms of deliberation that happen in policymaking, and reducing then stakeholders' influence over policy, including women's influence over policy. Across the globe, women comprised about 1/3 of the task forces that national governments formed to address COVID-19. The regional averages were a high of 31% in Europe to about 15% in Asia. And Marianne mentioned my colleague Jess Smith's research in the UK, which showed that women politicians and women experts rarely were the voice of COVID. And that has been replicated globally. Women experts, women politicians were rarely quoted in the news about COVID, whether it was the United States and the UK or Nigeria. So the marginalization of women politicians, women experts, women activists from COVID-19 response and recovery has had some severe consequences. So my colleagues have spoken, and we know about how most pandemic job losses and thus losses to GDP from the workforce, the so-called she-cession, as our colleagues in Canada have termed it. And we know the she-cession is driven by the inequitable division of household labor. So women, whether they are in London, Los Angeles, Mexico City, or Cape Town, are usually responsible for the domestic chores, not just childcare, but also dependent adult care and elder care. In 2020, women lost 64 million jobs. That's $800 billion worth of GDP. Yet, only 8% of the globe's recovery plans have addressed the crisis of unpaid care work. Instead, Build Back Better across the globe is focused on investing in male-dominated sectors like construction and STEM. In the United States, for example, nearly all job growth in 2022 has gone to men. To give you an idea, the United States added 467,000 jobs in January. Only 188,000 of them went to women. Women are not returning to the workforce at the same rate as men. And on a more micro level, we're into the pandemic's 3rd year, and personal protective equipment still does not fit women's bodies, even though women frontline workers in healthcare pointed this out on day one. And all these trends, whether it is the underinvestment of care or the prioritization of job growth in male-dominated sectors, are going to hit women from minoritized and marginalized communities and groups the hardest. So I don't want you to leave thinking that I'm saying that women's leadership does not matter. It absolutely matters, but the point is we need more of it. In our study for the United Nations, we found that women leaders, whether prime ministers or local mayors, whether health ministers or local public health officials, did take swift and decisive and empathetic action, and they did take steps to recognize and soften the pandemic's disproportionate impact on women and girls and other marginalized and minoritized residents. This was especially true at the local level, where many women governors and women mayors had to work around the men leaders like Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro, who otherwise obstructed their efforts to take the pandemic seriously. But there are not enough women in these positions. For instance, in the UK, feminist groups in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England have released blueprints for feminist recovery plans. Feminist recovery plans include addressing the crisis of care, transforming the provision of care from a private good that women mostly provide for free in the home to a public good like any other city service that the government would provide. So we have seen some global South cities like Bogota in Colombia, Buenos Aires in Argentina, innovating around the public provision of care. But those are only 2 examples in a global survey that we have been doing at United Cities and local government of a serious effort to address the crisis of care. So where are we now? To wrap up, the public praise bestowed on leaders like Jacinda Ardern in the pandemic's early month was deserved and signaled a new demand for women leaders, but also obscures that most countries' male-dominated leadership structures remain intact, and that this rush to declare the pandemic over and get back to normal, despite what the rising case counts tell us, means the window to make innovative policy change is closing even more rapidly. But the problem is that getting back to normal was never that great for women and women of color and marginalized women to start with, as my colleagues have pointed out. So the solution is not just ensuring that women have access to government decision, but ensuring that they have influence over government decision, and that is from the grassroots to the national level. So thank you so much.
So, not a lot to talk about then. Wowzers, where to start? And now I've corrected the Slido code, just to remind you, interval break, 732-505. The questions are starting to come in, which are weaving nicely with some of the things going through my head. Let's kick off with that example in Bogota, Jennifer. So it is possible to do things differently. And that was one way in which policy was different. I'm interested from everybody what your views are. We've heard a lot about, well, had women been in the room, had women been involved, what other kind of policy things do you think would have changed? What other differences would we have seen had women been at that top table? Do you want to kick us off, Jennifer, and then I'll take contributions from everyone else?
Sure, and thank you so much for that question, Heidi. I think one thing that's really important is that in the pandemic's first 6 months, let's say, going back 2 years, a lot of national and local governments did, recognize to some extent, right, the challenges with workforce exits, the challenges of homeschooling, and we saw a lot of temporary investment in childcare support or domestic care support. The challenge really now is that with this rush to declare the pandemic over, that, those emergency measures have disappeared. These emergency social protection measures that many governments did implement to try to soften the blow around, say, mortgage reliefs or rent reliefs, they're all disappearing. But the point is the pandemic is not over. And women and other marginalized groups are still feeling the blow. And so what makes innovations like Bogota and Buenos Aires stand out is that they're converting those emergency measures into long-term ways of doing politics differently, right? And it's not the case that it's always been women leaders. Bogota does have a woman mayor. She's actually the country's first out lesbian woman mayor, so intersectionality really matters. But Buenos Aires has a lot of women in power, but not the women governor at the moment. And it is about sort of the gender sensitiveness that any government can take, whether or not women are there, and thinking about doing things differently. And what makes the Bogota policy so innovative is it's not just more money for care work, but it's actually providing that service. And their commitment is that within a 30-block radius, every resident will have access to childcare, elder care, dependent care, and city services that do things like laundry, cleaning, and cooking. So it really is thinking, well, we provide a bus to get you to work. We're also going to provide food, right? And that this is just going to become a public good. And that's actually really different than just a subsidy, right? Or a one-time handout to lower the cost. And I think that's the kind of policy innovation that COVID gave us a window to think about. And we need to keep that window open.
Any other thoughts on what would have been different, you think? Marianne, you talked a lot about on the press and the presentational side of things. What would have been different in your view if more women had been involved?
I think women politicians would have done more to recognise the ridiculously disproportionate amount of unpaid work that women were having to do during the pandemic. Hardly ever heard a male politician even mention that. And it was really, really affecting our lives. I think female politicians would have opened schools earlier, shut them down less, because that was the main problem, certainly for women with school-age children, or parents, I should say, with school-age children. I think looking forward, flexible working can be a fantastic boon to, and I'm deliberately saying parents rather than mothers, but an extraordinary boon for parents. At least, I know lots of work can't be done flexibly, but a lot of work can be. And I think that if employees can demand flexible working from day one, the law needs to be changed to allow that to happen. The government said they were going to, and now I think they're going back on it. I think that would help enormously. But I think we talked about role modeling earlier for particularly for women of color, but actually we need role modeling for men. So we need many more senior men in organizations to take advantage of flexible working. so that more junior men think that it's okay to do so and that they won't be held back and they won't be punished if they do. And then if you start to get fathers working flexibly as well as mothers, then women are going to be discriminated against less. Because what happens at the moment is that if you are a woman of childbearing age, basically if you're between about 20 and 45, a lot of employers will be reluctant to employ you because they'll think, oh, she'll just go off and have babies. If men start to take advantage of parental leave and then flexible working after they have children too, that really levels the playing field, because you're not going to discriminate against all employees aged between 20 and 45, or you won't have any employees. So it hugely helps women if men start to take advantage of this sort of thing. But I think that really requires leadership from the top and role modeling from the top.
And you're right, because it's about normalizing the playing field, isn't it? It's not one more than the other. It needs to be the same for everybody, and then we are equal.
Yeah, and if it's only women who take it, that, as Jennifer says, that's just perpetuating the stereotype that women should be disproportionately responsible for bringing up children. I think having children is a team effort, frankly, and I think both parents should take equal, should participate equally in it.
Agreed. There was one just drawing on. There's one comment, I think it was Nicola, that you mentioned around that return to the workplace, build back better. Was it? I think that was you or Jennifer possibly, but that we seem to be focusing in the COVID recovery, construction, male kind of industries. Does that mean, and there's a question we've had, 100 years ago we got the vote. What's changed? If we are building back better with male industry in mind, has COVID really set us back?
Yeah, I think that was a Jennifer. I think Jennifer.
I'm sure you've got a view on it, Nicola.
Yeah, of course. I've got a view on it.
Go ahead, Nicola. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So that is valid, because if we are building back better and we are starting with traditionally male focused environments like construction, like the energy firms, the oil and gas firms, then what does that say for non-male dominated environments, especially to your point, 100 years ago we got a vote? Does it feel like anything has changed? To be honest, sometimes when you look, especially from my own point of view in terms of corporate and financial services, which is where I've typically worked, which is another male dominated area, it does feel like we've not moved any further forward. And that's why I love the points that Marianne just made right now around we need to normalize the fact that having children is a team effort, and it's no more important to women than it is to men. And I've seen this sort of very these stereotypes that then becomes really dangerous, because what happens is a woman who has a job, has a demanding job in a bank, that is married to a partner that also probably has another job in another industry. She's the one that sort of gets up at 5 and I have to pick up the children from the after school club. And then there's that thing, that sort of impression that she's not as committed. And that is why we have things like the mommy track, because that is for women who have to get up at 5 and cannot go for drinks in the pub, or that cannot come in early enough because they have caring responsibilities. And what then happens is, to Marianne's point, you have a lot of senior men who, because of the fact that they probably have a lot of money and they can afford to live on one income, they have their wives at home that don't work, and then they think that all women, like that is the reality for all women. I can remember one time when I worked in the bank, I had one of those bosses, and then I had to pick up. I had to he put a meeting at 6 o'clock, and I said, well, you probably have, your wife has picked up your children since 3:15. My 9 after school club, I have to go at 6 o'clock, and it was like a revelation, to him, that you actually have to, you have to go. Like, yes, I do have to go. Like, not all women stay at home, right? And so it was just that normalization of the fact that that's just what women do, and that is the men that sort of drive their careers forward. And I think if men do sort of normalize that sort of working flexibly, working from home as well, taking time out, taking parental leave, then it would become that norm. That role model piece is really important, and then women wouldn't be penalized, for that. And so, the answer to the question is, does it feel like we've moved forward since we've got the vote? When I look into the dynamics of the corporate structure, especially some of the bigger organizations, is still very, very tough for women because the industry norm or the societal norm is almost like is more important for women to ensure that children are cared for than it is for men. Like men are secondary partners and women are the primary partners. And that is a very damaging stereotype.
So if we do worry about gender benefits, we've mentioned, of course, the fabulous New Zealand Jacinda could break those stereotypes. That wow, there's a woman that can. Who knew? Resham, you're deeply involved with getting more women into Parliament. How many Jacindas do we need, and how are we going to get them?
The more the better. In terms of how many do we need, we're 51% of the population. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't, hope for or work towards 51% of democratically elected representatives. The reality is politics is very, very difficult, and we know we have a gender pay gap. Most people, and I didn't know until I started trying, but when you're a candidate, as you know, you're not paid. In fact, you spend a huge amount, an inordinate amount of your energy, time and resource and money trying to get elected, paying for things, paying for fundraisers and traveling around the country. And there's no guarantee that you'll ever get elected anyway, but you're asking people for a 5, 10, 15-year commitment of their lives with no guarantee that there'll be a financial reward at the end in terms of a job. And so if you're a woman who has childcare responsibility and that burden falls on you, or you have parents to look after, you are in, on average, a lower paying job than your male peers who are also going for Parliament, and you're going up against these the beliefs and the stereotypes that people have in their head. I mean, I love the book Invisible Women. I'm sure you've all read it, but anyone in the audience who hasn't, please do, chapter at a time, because it made my blood boil, and that's all I could do in one go. But when you ask people, even as young as, children who are as young as 5, when you ask them what a prime minister looks like or what a leader looks like, boys and girls draw men. And so we're starting at that young an age, which means that when you have adult women who are already having to face the barriers of lower pay, the responsibilities, and then on top of that, the misogyny, the sexually underlying abuse online, of course, it's a less desirable career path. So it's about how do you tackle all of that rather than just saying we want the best person for the job, or why don't more women come forward? We have to encourage them to come forward and support them to come forward. And I do think that should involve actual punishments and penalties for people who threaten death or rape online, because if it's unacceptable in the real world in person, why should somebody be allowed to threaten to harm me online? And Heidi, you'll know many MPs, as I do, who stood down because they got tired of having to physically wear a panic button, who have had tyres slashed, who have had swastikas daubed on their doorsteps, and have been advised to move house as if that's the solution. How many women are going to listen to that and think, cool, yeah, that's a job I'd like to do? And after 10 or 15 years, it's a big ask of people. So it's about how can we make that more appealing, and how can we support the women and the allies that help, because there are many great men who are helping across all parties and political spectrums to get that to happen. But until there's real support and protection, until we tackle these gender stereotypes that start so young, we're going to find it very difficult to get these great Jacindas out one end if what we're putting in at the other end is a very small number of women that we teach are capable of being leaders. And then just one other thing to add is, you mentioned, people have mentioned, others on this panel, about women of a certain age. You get to a certain age, and I was advised last year after I got married to make sure I didn't wear my engagement ring or wedding ring to interviews, because of course a woman of my age with a ring on would be suggesting that babies were the next thing on my mind. When you go to selection as a woman of a certain age, it's the women who are asked, what does your husband think, or who will look after your children? And actually studies show that men are considered to be more reliable, more trustworthy and more capable in the workplace when they become fathers, whereas women are believed to be less committed, more distracted. And actually men during the pandemic, multiple studies showed that men reported their productivity rates and their levels of achievement increasing because they benefited from work from home because they lost out the travel time and got to work. Whereas women, by virtue of the fact that society expected them to do the childcare and or the fact that they had the lower incomes or felt they had to pick up the childcare, actually significantly reduced their productivity of paid labor, but of course picked up many hours, 4 hours on average, a day of unpaid labor. So there's so much around it that it requires a multi-pronged approach and a real recognition that this is not a woman's problem, but this is society's problem. And the sooner society comes together to tackle these issues of leadership in politics, in business, and in every realm, the better it will be for us as a society and a country.
Thank you, Resham. That takes me beautifully onto my next question, actually, because we talked a lot about politicians, but society has a role to play. And just by the way, I was one of those women MPs who stood down for exactly the reasons that you've described. So very close to home. So open the question up to all four of you. We've talked a lot about political leaders, whether it's a mayor doing something amazing in Bogota or how we could do something different in our own country. Is it just politicians' responsibility to get this right? If we have another pandemic, another global challenge of the scale of COVID, and we need to have more women in the room next time, is it just the politicians' responsibility or anyone else? Marianne, microphone is on immediately, has something to say. Go on.
I think it's men's responsibility generally. It's not just politicians, but men, why didn't you shape up when the lockdowns happened? Why didn't you share the chores equally? Why didn't you share the homeschooling equally? Your job isn't more important than your female partner's job. Your children should be just as important to you as they are to her. Men, you should really be stepping up. It's 2022, for goodness sake.
Yeah, interesting. One of the comments that's come in actually is, why didn't any of those men who spoke at the press conference just move out of the way? They must have known that women weren't being represented, but they didn't. But it's an excellent question. Why didn't they?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, men should be allies in this fight, I think, but they should be joining in. They should be saying to their female partner, yes, of course, your job's as important as mine. I'll do the mornings, you do the afternoons. The male cabinet ministers should be saying, well, hang on a minute, what about Therese Coffey? What about Liz Truss? I've been on 5 times. They haven't been on at all. Where have the men been in all this? We're always talking about fixing the women. I mean, Resham's completely right. We need to fix society as a whole. It's not women who need fixing. It's how we perceive women, how we react to women, how we interact with women. That's what's got to change.
And Jennifer, from your global studies looking at all of this, what other ideas can you give us about how, so we talked about the women, the men, the politicians, who else needs to play a part in this?
Well, I think I'll first build on Marianne's comment. I mean, I think she's 1,000% right. I think the challenge is that, for men, broadly speaking, to do this, I mean, we're talking about giving up power and we're talking about giving up privilege. And it's very difficult, right, for individuals who have power and privilege to consciously share it. So we have to sort of keep holding men accountable for not wanting to redistribute their power and redistribute their privilege. And to your point, Heidi, about, are we going backwards? And I spend a lot of time in international policy conversations. And there's always this sense, well, if we just had more data, we could convince those with power and privilege to take the plight of women or women of color, marginalized groups seriously. But what is striking about COVID is, yes, there are things we don't know at the micro level about some of the intersectional effects of COVID, but we know, right, what the effects of the pandemic have been on women and marginalized women and women of color. And what strikes me even is that even organizations that we don't think about as particularly women-friendly or feminist, like the IMF and the World Bank, have on their websites, you can Google them right now, blueprints for governments to follow gender-sensitive and sort of feminist-oriented recovery plans. So this is actually not a case where we don't have the data. And it's not a case where we don't know what to do, right? We know we can do things differently, but it is the case where those with power or privilege aren't listening. And sometimes I think they don't want to listen because the system is working for them. It's working for them when they have 6 opportunities to speak at the press conference rather than 5 or 2. And so I think that as we have to demand is accountability, right? We have to keep the pressure on those with power and those with privilege to transform their behaviors. And we have to, because we have to recognize what we're asking them to do, right? And stop saying please and start saying now.
Can I quickly come back on that, Jennifer? You're so right. But it's not just a question of asking men to be altruistic, because actually one of the most cheering pieces of research I came across when I was researching my book was that you think gender equality is going to be like a seesaw in which as women rise, men are going to fall. But actually, both in more gender equal countries and in more gender equal relationships, straight relationships, that is, in which the man and the woman share the childcare and the chores pretty equally, men are twice as likely to say they're satisfied with their lives, half as likely to be depressed, much less likely to get divorced. They tend to drink less, smoke less, take fewer drugs, get more sleep at night. And here is the absolute clincher for any men watching. They get more frequent and better sex. So guys, what's not to like about this? It's really in your interest.
You know, I also want to jump in, if I may, Heidi, and then I'll.
Of course, and then we'll go to Russia.
I want to go up to the policy level, right? So Marianne gives us
bring
an individual
us back to the right level.
But also, you know, this is about the quality of democratic governance as well, right? So everything that Marianne highlighted for our individual and our personal relationships, and we have more equality, happens at the democratic level, right? So my research with my co-authors actually shows that when more women are represented in government, people feel that their system is more trustworthy. They feel that their system is more legitimate. They're more likely to accept the decisions that their government makes. And that's true even among citizens or voters who identify as politically conservative. They also prefer more diverse governments. So it's not necessarily that women will save democracy, because it's the responsibility of everyone to save democracy and practice good democratic governance. But we know that diversity is actually key to effective and better governance. And I'll stop there.
I just wanted to, thanks, Heidi. I just wanted to add the point, because you asked which groups we hadn't mentioned that were responsible. And I think when it comes to the politics element, but also what we are explaining, how we shape society in terms of messaging, the big group we haven't mentioned is the media. And I remember, I won't name the paper because it doesn't really matter, because lots of papers of the United Kingdom, and this front page of the newspaper is reducing that down to their legs. And, you know, as a woman in politics and hoping to be a politician at the time, I looked at that and thought, how am I, with a straight face, going to go to other incredible women in business and, you know, in non-political roles where I'm trying to do outreach and convince them that they should stand for Parliament? And how am I going to say to them, you'll have the chance to be taken seriously and make real change and contribute, when as the Prime Minister of the country, Theresa May at that time, on that front page, was reduced to a physical part of her body. And you see it, the Downing Street parade, catwalk parade, you know, people getting promotions, and then the women are talked about in terms of what they're wearing. And I do think that women have to deal with so much more focus on the way they look and the way they dress and how they behave and who they're interacting with. And it is a challenge, because it means that we as women need to stop reading those articles, but the writers who are writing them need to think about what they're putting into society, what message they're sending to an entire country, that as a woman you can be that high, that senior in a sector and still be thought of as body first. And I think that is a big responsibility that we need to take. It's the language too. You know, women are so often kind of bandied about with words like emotional. And it's like, well, if a man is emotional, then he's impassioned. But if a woman is, and there's this underlying misogynistic suggestion that she's not in control of her emotions and therefore, you know, should leave the job to the sensible men. And so I would really love to see more responsibility from the media, because actually it has so many connotations and implications beyond just that one article. It lasts, and that leaves a legacy, and that tells children of the next generation that women are not as serious, not as important, and not as valid as male leaders.
Totally agree with that, Resham. I think we've had in the last few years had some really poor standards of press reporting, actually, certainly on my watch during the Brexit period. And I remember my husband opening up a newspaper in a Barber's once, and I was there along with a lot of other Tory women candidates, Cameron Cuties we were called. So you're absolutely right. That's even my head, that sticks, and you know that influences what people see. So let's talk about some practical solutions. Because I was particularly interested in what you were saying, particularly after the Black Lives Matter, that a lot of corporates are, all great things, we're going to do this great policy, But actually, there's still a gap between the rhetoric and the great ideas and the headlines on their websites and the reality that people experience. How do we practically expose that difference, and what can we do about it?
Brilliant, Heidi. And I've just really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you again for having me. So what we are seeing in corporates is exactly what Jennifer described. Because I feel like sometimes, because it's not an easy problem to solve, like I'll be the first to admit, and we would all admit that it's not an easy problem to solve, whether you're solving it for greater representation of people from an ethnically diverse background or greater representation for women, because it's a societal issue. It's something that is built into the DNA and the fabric of the way our society is operated for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it is not easy. And because it's not easy, is very the temptation is to hide behind data or lack of data, right? And so a lot of people would say, well, we need data. We need data to let us know what to let us know what is the unknown. We need data to let us help quantify the issue. And what I say to some of the companies that I work with and that we work with at Career Masterclass is sometimes you need to forget about the data. And we need to forget about boiling the ocean and just start from somewhere. Because if you look at the experience of a young Black female associate that is sitting somewhere within your organization, feeling unrecognized, feeling underpromoted, underpaid, compared to the rest of our cohorts or compared to the rest of the other people from different races and backgrounds, she really doesn't care about the fact that whether you have data or not. She just wants you to do the right thing. She wants you to be able to implement some policies. She wants you to be able to marry your tone from the top with actions from the bottom. And she wants to be able to see clear changes that can impact on a day-to-day life today, right? And well, some of the things that we are seeing on a holistic and a more strategic play that is actually putting pressure on organizations is, we know that as a society, money talks, right? It's all about if you control the funds, if you control the access to capital, you can use that as a leverage. So what we are seeing is some of those big asset management houses, those big investors, the capital houses are saying to organizations, we will, for example, not underwrite your M&A, will not underwrite your debt offering, will not underwrite your IPO if you cannot show us in terms of diversity, in terms of female representation or ethnic minority representation, we will not put money into your business. Now, before all of that started happening, people had tried to make the business case for diversity. People had tried to make the human case for diversity. People had tried to be empathetic, but none of that worked. But until those big houses with trillions of dollars on assets under management, until they started saying, we will not, as part of their ESG, so the S, the social good in the ESG, until they started saying, actually, we will not underwrite this, and we will not underwrite your debt, or we will not underwrite your IPO, because until we can see that you have X number of women on your board, so we have X number of minorities, that is when the needle started moving. Now, there are some other organizations that have not needed that sort of leverage and that sort of carrot dangled in front of them. There's some organizations that have just said, it's the right thing to do. Like but what I've found in the organizations that are doing great on diversity, in terms of female diversity and ethnic minority diversity compared to the others, are the ones that have a CEO that is dialed into the situation, that is bought into the situation. Not a CEO that's saying, show me the business case. It's a CEO that's saying, you know what, it's a human rights issue. We don't need, it is the right thing to do. We don't need to, because there are so many McKinsey reports that come out every year, the business case for diversity. Companies that are diverse have performed their peers by 5% or 50%. All of those things are good. But if we boil it down to, it's just the right thing to do. That if 50% of the society are women, then why wouldn't those same women be allowed to progress at the same pace in an organization if they're as good, if not better than their male counterparts? So what we are seeing is the organizations that are winning this war are the ones that understand that is the right thing to do. And another thing that is factoring into the situation that we are seeing at the corporate level is because there is a war for talent out there. Now, we have, for the first time in forever, we have 3 generations of people in the workforce. So So we have the Gen Z, we have millennials, we have the baby boomers. We are all working side by side, but we all have different mantras and different ethos. The Gen Z, the Gen Z, the digitally native young ones are more socially conscious. And so they are choosing where they want to work. They are saying, we don't want to work in a place where all of these people are not representative of the people that I hang out with on TikTok, for example. They are saying that we don't want to work in a place where you don't put your money where your mouth is. They are saying we don't want to work in a place that is not that is in direct opposition with our values. So as a result of that, as we're coming out of the pandemic, we've run straight on into the Great Resignation, where people are saying, because of the pandemic and because I saw so many people die, I lost so many people and the whole world went crazy. Actually, my time is short and I want to choose where I spend my time, and I want to choose the kind of work I do. And I want to work with organizations that are purposeful. And so that is forcing organizations to rethink the way they treat employees, because the war for talent is really, really hot now. The fact that you can pay people does not mean people want to work where you are. We're seeing people have interviews and employees are asking organizations, what is your stance on diversity and inclusion? How many people look like me? How many women on your boards? How do you promote women versus men? How do you attract, retain, and promote ethnic minorities? So all over the country, up and down, especially big global organizations, they are being forced to change, not only because investors are driving the change, but also because the workforce and what they want is changing. And people are saying, actually, because of the pandemic and because we can see how the whole world can go to hell in a basket in overnight, I actually don't want to spend my time working for these organizations that actually don't show that they are a value-driven or a purpose-led organization. And we are seeing that from a bottoms-up perspective, how that is forcing the change. And that's very interesting to see.
And that's a glimmer of hope, isn't it?
Yes,
that there could be, because we need
is.
one of those right now. I certainly do.
Yeah.
That generational step change might demand better. And that ties in nicely with a question that's come in actually around, so what role does social media play in all of this, positively or negatively? Great way of passing messages around. Women not always presented terribly well on social media in terms of pornographic content. Yeah, what's the role of social media in all of this? Who's gonna give me their view on that? I've seen Jennifer nodding and shaking her head vigorously through that. Go on, Jennifer.
I mean, Heidi, Resham, I want to underscore, what you said. I mean, we have the data. We know that women are disproportionately abused on social media. Women in the public eye, prominent women, women of color, women with marginalized identities, all receive more abuse on social media. And there's also evidence that shows that it is more abusive than the kinds of abuse that's directed at men. It's more likely to use misogynistic content, violent sexual content. And we absolutely have to demand that that anonymity on social media cease, right? And that social media companies be required to hold abusers accountable. And again, there are other ways of doing things, right? In the most recent elections in Mexico, I'll give you an example, right? The Mexican government actually reached an agreement with Facebook and with some other social media providers that abusive content directed at candidates during the election would be taken down. Amazing, right? There are other ways to do this. There are actually ways to make it better. And I think that going back to the bigger picture of what kind of governance do we want, abuse and violence and intimidation and threats don't belong in democracies, right? That's not how you score your points. You shouldn't be scoring your points by driving those whom you disagree with, Heidi, out of politics through violence and fear. That is absolutely unacceptable. And it really is a very huge problem. And I actually also want to add that what has been troubling about the COVID era is the way that this climate of violence and intimidation abuse has been heightened by the politicization of COVID. I can speak from my country's perspective in the United States, right? And that actually we've started to see violence, intimidation, abuse visited on officials that are local public health officials, local school board officials, right? We might expect that at the national level, MPs might get some level of sort of, salty talk, right? It's not okay, but we might expect it. But our local public health officials who are civil servants, our local school board officials, right? We have had cases in California of armed protesters showing up outside the house of local public health authorities. Right, the vast majority of these are women, and we have had vast exits from local government, of local civil servants, because of the violence and intimidation and abuse. And that is really consequential for the kinds of public policies that we can have, and the kinds of safety we can have in our communities. So we have online abuse and in-person abuse, and we need more accountability and more sanctioning. It's not good for democracy, and it doesn't meet our standards of fairness. And yeah, how can we convince somebody from an underrepresented group, a woman of color, that this is what, this is the price of doing politics? It's simply not.
I agree, and that anonymity has to go. It's disgraceful that they're allowed. I had somebody threatening me and sharing where I lived on Facebook with some hard right activists, and Facebook and Twitter wouldn't take it down. The police asked them and they wouldn't take it down. I mean, it's extraordinary. Mary-Ann, I'd like to come to you, and I'll come to Resham because I can see you've got your microphone on. But I'm just interested, Mary-Ann, on the social media point, you've worked clearly in media your entire career. And Resham talked a while ago, and I should have come to you then, about traditional media. What is the role that media plays in this and the responsibility that they have?
Yeah, I mean, I thought Resham was completely right talking about how unfairly female politicians are treated compared with male politicians. That, forget Brexit, who won Legsit was probably the nadir. But I mean, I have a whole chapter of this in my book, and I say that there's a really simple way of correcting it, which is every time you write something about a female politician, ask yourself, would I have said this about a man? And if not, delete it. It's really simple. If you're talking about, a woman's penchant for stiletto shoes, or, the catwalk up to Downing Street or something, would I have said that about Dominic Raab? No, in that case, delete it. It's really, really simple. But I think there's more that the media can do. So Jennifer talked about how few female experts, for instance, were quoted in the media during COVID. I think it was only something like 19% worldwide of scientists quoted in the media were female. And yet many more than 19% of scientists are female. And that, again, is giving the message to people that men have more authority than women, that men are more expert than women, which they aren't. And again, this is the sort of thing that the media can very easily correct. So a science writer at The Atlantic, Ed Wong, decided to look through his previous year's articles and count how many male experts and how many female experts he had quoted. And he'd thought that he was, pretty liberal and it would be pretty equal. And he was horrified to discover he was quoting two or three times as many men as women. So he decided to correct it in the subsequent year, and he achieved 50-50. And he said it was very easy. It took perhaps 15 minutes more per article to find the female experts, because he said the men were always at the top of the Google search results because other male journalists had talked to them in the past, and then it just perpetuates itself. But he said it was very easy to do, to find female experts who were just as expert as the male ones. So it's just a question of being aware of the natural bias that a lot of us hold, women as well as men, and then to correct for it. And actually the FT now has a widget which actually looks at who gets quoted, which experts get quoted in the FT. And if it's many more men than women, then the writer will get an automatic, warning, you're quoting many more men than women. Again, this can even be automated.
Brilliant, I love that.
Yeah, but the media have a huge part to play. The BBC has introduced a new scheme called 50-50, in which they're trying to get half men and half women on screen as presenters, as experts, as pundits. I mean, obviously, if it's the Prime Minister, you've got to have him on. You can't change the gender. But where you do have a choice, they're trying. Lots of programs have signed it up to this, to have 50-50. And it has actually transformed BBC's coverage, I think. And now other media companies around the world are starting to do it. So it's A, very important, and B, very easy to correct for. But you've just got to want to correct for it.
It's just that bit of extra effort, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And not very much extra.
No, agree, but it's those small step changes, which is what the colour has been saying to us. Don't try and change the world overnight by coming up with some great big policy. Just do a bit and make a start. And Resham, I interrupted you. I think you wanted to come in just then.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. I mean, some really incredible points there. Well, all of you, but on the social media element, I mean, we've obviously got the online safety bill coming out this year. It really frustrates me that platforms can be really quick to take down a photo of somebody breastfeeding, which fine, if that's their policy, fine, but then to argue that they cannot act quickly and effectively to prevent rape threats and death threats and misogynistic abuse, it's laughable to me. And actually there should be far more force and strength and repercussions for businesses who enable abuse against people. And we know that it's BME women who suffer the most, but to enable that abuse and to pretend that they cannot do anything about that is laughable and very frustrating. And I think actually they need to take responsibility. But of course, I do think we've talked about the negative elements of social media, but there are positives too. When I stood in 2017, there were times when I wanted to go out campaigning and I couldn't, because I couldn't go alone as a woman. It wasn't safe. And of course, we've now had 2 awful murders of politicians. And it really frustrates me when people say, you know, they died, or, you know, they didn't die, they were killed. And actually, as a politician, you know, especially as a female politician, there's a real concern about personal safety when you're out alone. But the way to get around that was to use social media. And I put a Facebook video up. I spent £50 to boost it, and it had 15,000 views within a few days. And actually, social media does offer a very powerful way for people of all backgrounds, all ages, all genders, every kind of type of person to be able to influence and have their say, to be able to interact politically in a way that they couldn't before. But of course, with that freedom, with that reach, with that ability to speak your mind as you want, when you want, there does need to come the responsibility and the protection. And I would like to see us do more, you know, as a country, to protect people on these social media platforms, because 95% of people who use social media for political reasons, to learn or to share thoughts, do so in a positive way. And it's the abuse of bad apples that actually ruin it. And so if we could curtail that negative behavior, we could really see those platforms as a way of spreading messages and increasing engagement, especially amongst an age group, the millennials and Gen Z, who are perhaps less inclined to interact with traditional media or door knocking or, you know, campaigning, but do want to interact with policy issues in their own ways through social media. So I think there's a lot of positives if we could force platforms to take responsibility for the negatives. And Heidi, your example just shows there is absolutely no reason why that platform could not have taken down that abuse. And the fact that it had to wait for you to complain is in itself terrible, but the fact that they still didn't do anything about that is even worse.
You're right, it's disappointing, isn't it? Because the tools are there to be positive, and you know, we should be able to not run away from these things, but use them for the positive purpose that they can have. I want to bring us back a little bit to kind of emerging from COVID, if we are emerging. So just as we think life might be getting a little bit normal, whatever normal is, smack straight into, another fella, Putin, in Russia, and everything that the disaster, humanitarian nightmare every night on the TV screens. I'm sure you're the same as me, cannot believe that the situation can get any worse. And the economy's waking up to COVID, and we've got this perfect storm around a cost of living crisis now on the horizon. And the question that's being put to us is, as we emerge from COVID, we've kind of, I think we're agreeing between us that it has been a step backwards for women and women of colour, as Bukola has very clearly laid out for us. Is the cost of living crisis going to make it worse still for women? How's that going to work out? Marianne?
A lot of women feel, and again, this really isn't fair, that if they want to go back to work after having children, their salary has to cover the cost of childcare. I don't know why it isn't a joint responsibility, but you know, quite often women say, well, it's not worth my going back to work because I can't earn enough to pay the cost of childcare. Childcare costs are rising. Every other cost is going up even faster. So I think, you know, at the margin, it's going to be a lot harder, at least for mothers, to justify working, unless, again, you have a much more equal partnership.
It's not reasonable limited practice, so that all the sound is boring, but all the sound...
Agreed. Bukola or Jennifer, Resham, have you got any views on that, the cost of living crisis that we're going to? I think we're already in it. Bukola?
Yeah, you see that's something that really concerns me and worries me. And when I worry about that, I worry about a lot of single mothers up and down the country, because some people, just like Marianne was saying, women think I can't go back because it's not worth it's not worth me going back. But even in that, there is a choice because you have a partner who you can sort of fall back on, sort of like a household income. But there are some people that have no choice than to go back to work. And even if all of their income is swallowed up by childcare cost, but now they cannot even break even. They will be in deficits. There's already debate up and down the country and also on forums around, do people heat their homes or do they eat? Heating versus eating. And that I feel is a ticking time bomb that we are all sitting on, that I don't feel there's enough focus on right now, because childhood poverty, female poverty, all of those things are going to get worse. They absolutely will get worse. I was talking to a group of friends last night, and my friend, who is an audiologist, she's a doctor, she earns good money, was saying, I've received an energy bill for £1,400. I have not budgeted for this. I would have to take it out of savings. And I thought to myself, if an audiologist is feeling the pinch, what about a woman who already is struggling? She doesn't have any other partner. She doesn't earn a lot. How are people going to do this? So to your point, Heidi, it's going to get a lot worse. And women and children, as usual, we feel the brunt of this.
And I think to add to that, the challenge, thanks Heidi, I think the challenge is, of course, we know that there's a gender pay gap. We know that women are more likely to be in lower paid jobs, to receive lower bonuses, even if they are in the same paid jobs as men. There's a whole campaign about the right to know, to not ask women or ethnic minority background people about their previous earnings, because that only embeds a historic system where women and people of colour are likely to earn less. But we're now looking at 7% inflation according to the projections. And so what you're going to end up with is women being squeezed in terms of costs rising, but women are far less likely to be successful in successfully negotiating pay rises equivalent to those of their male peers. So you're going to end up with a situation where women are being squeezed in lower paid jobs from rising costs. And then in addition to that, the inequality of standard of living between men and women is likely to increase, because women's pay is unlikely to rise or to keep up with pace as the men who are generally, if you look at the studies and the stats, more likely to be able to successfully negotiate a higher pay rise. So actually it comes down to, and we'd spoken earlier about men and allies and those in positions of power actually proactively working to do good, that if you have a man coming into you to ask for a pay rise, don't just say yes without thinking, can I match this to my female employees across the board too? Because just because a woman doesn't ask, or just because you are subconsciously more likely to say yes to the man than the woman, does not mean that you shouldn't proactively work to counter that systemic imbalance that is going to penalise women more than men. So I think it's about being really conscious in those conversations in offices and in rooms where you have the ability to equalise something, even if a woman doesn't feel comfortable to come and ask you for that pay rise herself.
And actually, it's not can I just say, it's not just that, it's not even necessary that women aren't negotiating, because some research studies show that they do ask for pay rises as often as men do, but they're just not given them. And male hirers are 5 times more likely to say that they don't want to work with a woman who negotiates than with a man who negotiates. So women actually get punished if they do negotiate. There's a sort of Jordan Peterson school of thought that says, oh, the gender pay gap's all women's fault. If only they asked for more money, they'd get it. It's just not true.
I can't imagine ever, Marianne, in your life have you not walked into a room and asked for what you wanted. You're absolutely a shining example to us all. Jennifer, you've got your microphone off.
Bukola is absolutely right. If we think about the cost of living, right, cost of living increases, inflation, who are they going to hit the hardest? They're going to hit the folks that are already food insecure, the folks that are already housing insecure, the elderly, single parent households. And we know that those four groups, single parent households, food insecure, housing insecure, elderly, are disproportionately comprised of women. But I think there's a bigger concern here, and this actually goes, Heidi, to your comment about Putin, right? We already have been in for quite some time, whether it's the global north or the global south, a rising tide of right-wing populism, right? Putin is right there, with the Donald Trumps, with the Jair Bolsonaros. They might have slight differences in their styles. And what we are especially seeing in this right-wing populism is a particular kind of hegemonic masculinity and a toxic performative masculinity, right? That we see from Trump, that we see from Putin, that we see with Bolsonaro. Now, I think women absolutely can run as right-wing populists, right? We have an example of Marine Le Pen in France, but in general, right, this kind of hegemonic masculine style, hyper-masculine, toxic masculine has been a brand of right-wing populist men. And how does that connect to cost of living? I worry that these cost of living increases could continue to fuel voter demands for right-wing populism, right? Because voters aren't seeing their democratic leaders provide alternate solutions. So they're turning to these outsiders, these strong men who claim, right, that they can come in and bust up the institutions and fix it, right? And so I think that there's a human problem with the war, right, with the cost of living increases, but we also have to make sure that our democratic politicians are on message about this, because we don't want voters who are feeling the pinch to think that some of these toxic leaders have the solutions. Because if not, we're just going to stay in the cycle of democratic backsliding that really worries me as a political scientist. And I know we're getting close to time, and I hate to be so bleak. So if you come up with another question, Heidi, I can try to end on a more positive note. But again, going from the micro story of how cost of living increases are going to hurt the already marginalized to what could be the political consequences. I mean, we're seeing it in the United States. Right, Biden, I think, has done a actually very good job of managing the war in the Ukraine, but you can directly track his approval ratings going down to the price of petrol going up. And so these are worrying trends at national levels as well.
You're so right, Jennifer. You've just described my few months in politics. We tried Change UK, we tried that centre ground because politics was shifting. And just reflecting on it, my mum was German. She grew up in 1930s Germany. And very moderate family, but Hitler had the answers. When the economy was so depressed, a family would never entertain somebody like that, but he seemed to have the answers because nobody else did. And that is a really, really dangerous policy vacuum space to be in, and one that we have to be absolutely alert to. I am going to draw us to a close in a second, and positively, I have lots of questions of yeah, but what can I do about it? And I'm going to come to each of you for your views on how we inspire the audience tonight to not just be, moaning about it, angry about it, but doing something about it, because that is, I learned that in politics. It's not somebody else's job, it's your job. But before I do, I just want to mention one group of people, because I've had a number of comments on this and we haven't touched on it, principally because tonight we're talking about women. But Jennifer, you did just talk then about the marginalised groups, those that will be affected the most in firstly the COVID pandemic period, but also any cost of living squeeze, and it's the disabled. I've had 3 comments literally in the last 5 minutes around how COVID has affected them. Women more likely to be disabled, come on, accessibility laws, sort it out, returning to the workplace. Can you talk to us a little bit about the impact that they're going to feel?
Absolutely. I think we know that having a disability is another structure of marginality. And what I also find so troubling about the COVID discourse, and I will only speak from my own perspective as the US, and I'll speak from the US perspective, is the way we have, and our rush to get back to normal, completely forgotten about our empathy and duty of care to people with disabilities, as we say here, or the disabled, as you say in the UK, this kind of sense that the rest of us, we simply aren't worried about the disabled who cannot. Right, both because of their
miles away.
What's
going on?
A just and equitable society, and the way COVID makes them.
Fight the life out of me. I was wondering what the fuck was going on.
Shameful, and I really want to thank those commentators for reminding us, right, about the duty of care and equity to people with disabilities, and they have really gotten the short end of the stick since day one of COVID.
Yeah, the costs of life if you're living with a disability are higher anyway, let alone when a cost of living crisis kicks in. I mean, the price
What are you thinking?
from your home, at least, people with disabilities more likely to spend.
I'm going to be playing Elite
than they are
tomorrow.
going out, so that cost is going to be an absolute double whammy for them.
I'll watch the end of this,
so
obviously.
You're right to talk about that. We have no time apparently, but I'm sure we can squeeze in a 30-second roundup from each of you. People are asking me, what can we do about it?
Civ, we can do Civ.
Great, brilliant. I think for me, it's just it's simple. Like sometimes
you're not got League on then, no?
As good as they are, people can leave feeling, oh my God, the enormity of the issue is just so large. So what I would say to everyone is like, don't even think about it as a very, macro issue. Think about what can you do? If you can affect just one person, if you can advocate for one woman, if you are in a meeting in the workplace and the voice of the woman is not heard, if you can give up your privilege for a little bit and allow a woman of color, a person of color, or a woman to go ahead of you, or for you to lend your voice to that woman, like that is what you should focus on doing. If we all focus on the micro, like the macro will take care of itself. So we've had interesting discussions, but you just focus on that one thing you can do. Just be more intentional, be more aware, and hope to change the life or the daily experience of just one person. And you would have done a lot in moving this conversation forward.
I love that. One person. It's an equal match, isn't it? And then we transform everything. I love that. Resham.
So a few things. One, I think really important, bring as many allies on board as you can. Fathers, husbands, brothers, help them to understand why this is important, not just a woman's issue, because so many men will support you doing it, but you need them to understand why they need to be doing it too. Tackle your own internalized misogyny. If you catch yourself thinking, oh, that should be a man, or asking
you're
to
listening
the boss
to
and
this.
assuming it's a he, catch yourself, change the language.
Catch your toxic masculinity.
Lift each other up. So whether that's helping people in your network or your friends think about how they can get an extra pay rise,
It's wise words, these are.
Or mentoring people at different stages to you. And most importantly,
I mean, a lot of people seem to think that like catching your toxic masculinity means like restraining yourself, wearing pink and a little tutu.
If you are interested,
and don't get me wrong, if that's something you wish to do,
get in touch with 50/50.
Danny, my love, you are more than welcome. But the reality of catching your toxic masculinity is just like not being a dick solely because you're a man. It's not complicated. In the same respect that you shouldn't be a dick solely on the basis of being white.
Especially if we think about the political
like,
and don't give in to fear.
Or because you're straight or whatever.
Is to convince people that the pie.
That doesn't mean that
what it means is that people fight.
If you're gay or black or whatever, you can also be a dick too. That is a thing.
In fact, we see governments, whether they're national or local,
but
so the pie can grow.
Funny, interesting.
A certain set of choices, and if the pie can grow, then that means more benefit,
more pie
for everyone. So I would just urge people:
more pie.
Don't give in to the natural instinct to feel that you're being pitted against someone else. I think we've heard from everyone, right, that we all grow when we're more inclusive and more.
Can't comment.
So that would be my message.
No chat.
Thank you, Jennifer. And last word to you, Marianne.
Okay, I would say at a macro level, what the pandemic has showed us is that women can make fabulous leaders. And
women can make fabulous leaders. That's true.
Huge meta studies of.
Imagine if we'd have had Jacinda rather than fucking bumbling buffoon Boris. His name literally rhymes with bumbling buffoon. Oh my God.
More highly than women do. And at a micro level, I would say to men, as I said earlier, you've seen how much work now has to be done at home.
Imagine Jacinda on every week, just speaking to you like your naughty children.
Please just join me.
Because that's basically what it seemed like she did with it. Now, come on, people. It was all like.
Happier and healthier. It will make your children happier and healthier. Everybody gains from this.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, every single one of you, for contributing so passionately tonight. Women get stuff done.
I think that's Heidi Allen, who used to be an MP for the Tories. And one of the many people that was a Tory that I was genuinely like, that what? They're a Tory MP? Like, especially after hearing them speak as well. You were like, really? Okay. I thought she was just stood on the wrong side of the house, you know? Just, oh, there's no seats over there, I'm going to sit over there, sort of thing. I'm not standing, fuck that shit. And then I found out she was Tory, and I was like, what? Sarah Wollaston, do you remember her as well? Dr. Wollaston. She was a GP. She was a Tory MP and GP. How can you square away being a GP and a Tory MP at the same time?
God knows, man.
You must know how much you're being fucked over. Like, you of all people, I mean,